the bloodhound's nose pressed against trampled earth, steam rising from its nostrils in the Virginia dawn. This single moment would define how America hunted its own people for the next 30 years. William Tate crouched beside his dog, reading the story written in broken twigs and disturbed leaves, tracking a family that had fled their plantation 3 nights before. The scent of pine sap mixed with morning dew hung thick in the forest air, while somewhere ahead, bare feet had left impressions in moss, soft as velvet. Tate's calloused fingers traced the tracks with the precision of someone who understood that human desperation followed predictable patterns. Parents always carried their children when the path grew rough. At 24, Tate had already earned a reputation across 3 counties as the most effective slave catcher in Virginia. Plantation owners paid him $50 per returned fugitive, plus expenses. But effectiveness, as his neighbors would soon learn, meant something different to William Tate than it did to other bounty hunters. The family he tracked consisted of Samuel, his wife Ruth, and their twin daughters, barely 6 years old. They belonged to Colonel Harrison's tobacco plantation outside Richmond, where Samuel worked as a blacksmith and Ruth tended the main house. 3 days earlier, they'd heard whispers that the twins were to be sold to settle gambling debts. By midnight, they were running. Tate found their first camp at sunrise on March 15, 1833. Cold ashes, footprints leading north, and something else that made him smile with grim satisfaction. A child's rag doll, dropped in haste, still carrying the scent that would seal their fate. From the Richmond Inquirer, March 20th, 1833. Noted slave catcher William Tate returned 3 fugitives to Colonel Harrison's estate. 4th member of family reported lost to wilderness conditions. But the neighbors who lived near Tate's cabin told different stories in whispered conversations. They'd seen him return from hunts with fewer captives than he'd been hired to find. They'd noticed how his payment requests sometimes included charges for disposal of damaged property. Most disturbing of all, they'd observed the peculiar satisfaction that crossed his face when discussing the ones who didn't make it back alive. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, whose farm bordered Tate's property, later recalled hearing gunshots from the forest, followed by the baying of satisfied hounds. When she asked Tate about the disturbance, he'd simply replied that some problems solved themselves more efficiently than others. The twins never made it home. Before we delve deeper into this dark chapter of American history, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. If stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records and family whispers for almost 2 centuries. Tate's methods differed from other slave catchers in ways that wouldn't become clear until years later, when patterns emerged from scattered incidents across Virginia's backwoods. While most bounty hunters focused on returning valuable property intact, Tate seemed to take personal pleasure in the chase itself. The capture was just the beginning. His cabin sat on 12 acres of dense woodland, isolated from the nearest neighbor by 2 miles of twisted paths and creek beds that discouraged casual visitors. The local sheriff, a man named Douglas Creek, had received complaints about strange sounds emanating from Tate's property, but complaints about slave catchers rarely warranted investigation in 1833 Virginia. Children from nearby farms were forbidden to play near Tate's boundary markers. Parents told them stories about the bad man in the woods, never specifying exactly what made him dangerous, but understanding intuitively that some knowledge was too heavy for young minds to carry. What those parents didn't know was that Tate had begun keeping detailed records of his hunts, including sketches and notes that revealed a mind descending into something far darker than simple greed or professional ruthlessness. Savagery disguised as efficiency. The real horror began when plantation owners started requesting Tate, specifically, not just for his success rate, but for his reputation. Word spread that fugitives who encountered William Tate served as powerful deterrents to other would-be escapees. Fear, it seemed, was more valuable than individual human lives. But fear works both ways, and Tate was about to discover that some prey fights back in ways that would transform him from hunter into something else entirely. Something that would make even hardened slave owners question whether they'd hired a man or unleashed a demon into Virginia's wilderness. The leather-bound journal lay open on Tate's kitchen table, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting that transformed human suffering into neat columns of profit and loss. Each entry began the same way: date, weather conditions, number of fugitives, and outcome. The outcome column revealed the true nature of William Tate's business. The smell of tobacco smoke clung to yellowed curtains, while candle wax pooled in brass holders, creating an atmosphere of calculated domesticity that masked the horror documented within those pages. Outside, spring rain drummed against window panes streaked with Virginia clay, washing nothing clean. March 22, 1833, marked a turning point in Tate's methods. The Pemberton plantation had hired him to retrieve a young man named Isaiah, who'd fled after learning he was to be sold away from his elderly mother. The standard fee was $50 for live return, $25 for proof of recapture if the fugitive died during pursuit. Tate found Isaiah 2 days later, hiding in a tobacco barn 15 miles north of Richmond. The young man was exhausted, dehydrated, but alive and capable of walking back to his owner. According to Tate's journal entry, Isaiah offered no resistance when discovered. Subject located in Henley's tobacco barn. No struggle. Return deceased due to aggressive behavior requiring defensive action. The lie sat there in brown ink, preserved between pages that chronicled dozens of similar deceptions. Isaiah's body bore a single gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range while he knelt with his hands raised. 3 witnesses would later testify to this fact, but only after Tate was beyond the reach of Virginia justice. Mrs. Margaret Henley, who owned the barn where Isaiah was found, described a scene that contradicted every official report. She'd been hanging laundry when she heard voices from her tobacco shed. Peering through a gap in the wooden slats, she witnessed Tate speaking calmly to Isaiah for several minutes before drawing his pistol. The boy was begging, she told her husband that night. On his knees, begging for his life. Tate shot him like putting down a sick dog, but Mrs. Henley never spoke to authorities. In 1833, Virginia, a white woman's word against the slave catchers carried little weight, especially when that slave catcher had the backing of powerful plantation owners who valued results over methods. The Pemberton family paid Tate the reduced fee without question, accepting his story of necessary violence during a dangerous recapture. They displayed Isaiah's death as a warning to other potential runaways, never suspecting they'd paid for cold-blooded murder disguised as professional duty. Death became a tool of intimidation. Tate's reputation spread through Virginia's plantation network with the speed of whispered secrets. Owners began requesting his services, not just for difficult cases, but as a deterrent. The mere mention of William Tate's involvement was often enough to discourage escape attempts before they began. His rates increased accordingly. By summer, he was charging $75 per fugitive, with a bonus structure that rewarded particularly creative solutions to the runaway problem. Plantation owners competed to share stories of Tate's effectiveness at social gatherings, each tale growing more elaborate in the telling. Colonel Harrison, who'd hired Tate to retrieve Samuel's family, boasted at a Richmond dinner party about his slave catcher's innovative approach to preventing future escapes. He never mentioned that only 3 of 4 family members had returned, or that the surviving members had been too traumatized to speak for weeks after their capture. The truth lived in details, too small for polite conversation. Samuel's hands shook uncontrollably for months after his return. Ruth stopped singing the spirituals that had once echoed through the slave quarters. The surviving twin, a girl named Grace, developed a stutter that persisted into adulthood. What had they witnessed in those Virginia woods that ordinary brutality couldn't explain? What had William Tate done that transformed capture into something resembling ritual torture? The answers lay hidden in the pages of his journal, where human beings became experimental subjects in a study of fear, pain, and the precise moment when hope died in human eyes. Tate was documenting more than successful captures. He was creating a manual for psychological destruction. His next target would test these refined methods on a subject who refused to break, setting in motion events that would expose the monster lurking behind Virginia's most trusted slave catcher. Sarah Mitchell knelt in the forest clearing, her dark hands pressed against bark, rough as sandpaper, while morning dew soaked through her cotton dress. The scent of wild honeysuckle, mixed with her own fierce sweat, created a perfume of desperation that would guide her hunters straight to this moment of reckoning. This wasn't just another runaway case. Sarah represented everything William Tate had learned to despise about slaves who dared to think themselves worthy of freedom. She could read, write, and worse still, she taught these dangerous skills to others in secret gatherings that threatened the very foundation of Virginia's social order. Sarah's father, Moses Mitchell, served as the unofficial preacher for 3 plantations in Goochland County. Master Thomas Randolph permitted these religious gatherings, believing that Christian instruction made slaves more docile and obedient. What Randolph didn't know was that Moses used Bible stories to encode escape routes and safe houses along the Underground Railroad. The daughter had inherited her father's intelligence and his dangerous sense of justice. At 19, Sarah had already helped 7 families reach freedom through a network of Quaker sympathizers and free blacks who risked everything to guide fugitives north. Her latest act of rebellion had finally pushed Randolph beyond tolerance. She taught a group of slave children to spell their own names. From the Goochland County court records, April 10th, 1833, Thomas Randolph versus Sarah Mitchell. Property. Charges: unlawful assembly, instruction in letters, inciting discontent among chattel property. The punishment was to be public whipping, followed by sale to a cotton plantation in Georgia, far from family and the network she'd built. Sarah chose flight over submission, disappearing into the Virginia wilderness on the night before her scheduled punishment. Randolph hired William Tate within hours of discovering her absence. The fee was $100 for live return, with explicit instructions that Sarah was to be brought back capable of serving as an example to other potential troublemakers. Tate's reputation for creative discipline had reached even Goochland County, but Sarah Mitchell possessed advantages that Tate's previous victims had lacked. Her father's congregation had prepared for this possibility, creating a support network that stretched from Richmond to the Pennsylvania border. More importantly, Sarah understood that knowledge was the only weapon slaves could wield without detection. She'd studied William Tate just as carefully as he'd studied his prey. Through whispered conversations and careful observation, Sarah had learned about Tate's methods, his patterns, even his psychological weaknesses. She knew he preferred hunting alone, that he relied on terror rather than tracking skill, and most crucially, that his sadism made him predictable. The confrontation came on April 15, 1833, in a clearing where 2 creek beds merged to form deeper water. Sarah had chosen the location deliberately, understanding that Tate's bloodhounds couldn't follow scent across running water. She'd also positioned herself near an escape route that most hunters would never consider. When Tate emerged from the tree line, his pistol drawn, and his dogs straining against their leads, Sarah was waiting. She stood with her back to the creek, hands visible, showing no sign of the fear that had consumed his previous victims. "Sarah Mitchell," Tate called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness he used to lull fugitives into compliance. "Your master's worried sick about you, girl. Time to come home." Sarah's response would be remembered word for word by the 3 witnesses hidden in the forest, including her father Moses, who'd tracked Tate's movements through the same network that guided runaways to freedom. "I have no master but Jesus Christ," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of someone who'd found courage in scripture and community. And he has already set me free. Tate's smile revealed teeth stained with tobacco and something darker than mere amusement. This was the moment he lived for, when defiant slaves learned the cost of challenging the natural order. He'd broken stronger spirits than Sarah Mitchell's. Monsters feed on helplessness. What happened next would transform both predator and prey in ways neither expected, creating ripples that would eventually expose the full scope of William Tate's crimes to a community that had chosen blindness over justice for too long. The creek water ran red that afternoon, but not with the blood that Tate had intended to spill. The gunshot echoed through the forest like divine judgment, sending birds exploding from treetops in a chaos of wings and frightened cries. But when the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, William Tate lay face down in the creek bed, while Sarah Mitchell stood holding his smoking pistol with hands steady as stone. The metallic tang of blood mixed with creek water created a smell that would haunt this clearing for decades to come. While somewhere in the forest, 3 witnesses processed what they'd just observed. Moses Mitchell emerged first, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions as he stared at his daughter and the man who would never hunt another soul. Sarah had planned this confrontation with the precision of someone who understood that half measures meant death. When Tate raised his weapon, expecting her to cower like his previous victims, she'd done something unprecedented among his encounters with fugitive slaves. She'd fought back with intelligence. The creek crossing Sarah had chosen wasn't random. The water pooled deep enough to hide the iron spike she'd driven into the creek bed at an angle designed to catch an unwary foot. When Tate stepped forward to deliver what he assumed would be another lesson in white supremacy, his boot found the hidden trap. As he stumbled, Sarah lunged, not for the gun barrel, but for Tate's wrist, using leverage and desperation to redirect his aim. The pistol discharged into his own chest, the ball tearing through ribs and lung before lodging somewhere near his heart. From the private journal of Moses Mitchell, April 15, 1833. My daughter has done what no slave was supposed to do. She has killed a white man and lived to tell about it. God forgive us all for what comes next. But what came next wasn't divine retribution or swift justice. What followed was something far more complex and revealing about the nature of power in 1833 Virginia. Tate's body sank into the creek water, his blood creating ribbons of red that dispersed downstream toward the James River. Sarah stood motionless for several heartbeats, processing the magnitude of what she'd accomplished and the impossibility of surviving its consequences. In Virginia, killing a white man was a capital offense for any black person, slave or free. Even self-defense provided no legal protection when the defendant's skin marked them as property rather than citizen. Sarah Mitchell had just signed her own death warrant with William Tate's blood. Moses Mitchell understood this reality with crushing clarity. His daughter had saved herself from one monster, only to awaken a larger one that would consume their entire community. Unless they acted quickly and with perfect coordination, Sarah's act of self-defense would become justification for unspeakable retaliation against every black person in Goochland County. The 3 witnesses made a pact in that blood-stained clearing. William Tate had never found Sarah Mitchell. The slave catcher had simply vanished while pursuing his quarry through Virginia's wilderness. His body would sink deeper into the creek bed, weighted down with stones and the collective silence of a community that had finally found its voice. But communities, like creeks, have ways of revealing their secrets. What Moses Mitchell and his co-conspirators couldn't predict was how thoroughly William Tate had documented his crimes, or how his disappearance would eventually lead to discoveries that exposed the full scope of his sadism. Truth has its own current. Sarah Mitchell fled to Pennsylvania that same night, guided by the Underground Railroad network her father had helped build. She reached Philadelphia 6 days later, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that she'd killed the most feared slave catcher in Virginia. Meanwhile, Thomas Randolph waited for news of his property's recapture, growing increasingly agitated as days passed without word from his hired hunter. By April 20th, he'd organized search parties to look for both the missing slave and the missing slave catcher. What they found in William Tate's cabin would reveal horrors that no one in Goochland County had imagined possible, transforming a simple case of property recovery into something that challenged every assumption about the men they'd trusted to maintain their way of life. The monster's den was about to be opened, and its contents would prove that some evil grows in darkness until it consumes everything around it. Sheriff Douglas Creek pushed open the door to William Tate's cabin, releasing a stench that made his deputy gag and step backward into the Virginia sunshine. The smell of rotting meat, mixed with unwashed human misery, created an atmosphere so thick it seemed to coat the inside of their throats with its putrid weight. What they discovered inside transformed their search for a missing slave catcher into something that would haunt Goochland County for generations. This wasn't a hunter's cabin. It was a charnel house disguised as domestic normalcy, where William Tate had been conducting experiments that redefined the boundaries of human cruelty. The main room appeared ordinary enough at first glance, furnished with a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that had seen regular use. But Creek's trained eye noticed details that told a darker story. Iron rings bolted into the walls, chains hanging from the ceiling beams, and stains on the wooden floor that had soaked too deep for ordinary cleaning to remove. Tate's journal lay open on the table, its pages revealing the systematic documentation of horrors that went far beyond simple slave catching. Each entry detailed not just the capture of fugitives, but their subsequent treatment in this cabin before they were either returned to their owners or disposed of permanently. From William Tate's journal, March 8, 1833. Subject 17 showed remarkable resistance to standard persuasion methods. Implemented enhanced techniques for 6 hours before achieving compliance. Returned to owner in functional condition, though somewhat diminished capacity noted. The clinical language disguised torture sessions that had been refined over years of practice. Tate had transformed the business of slave catching into something resembling medical experimentation, treating human beings as subjects in a study of pain tolerance and psychological breakdown. Deputy Marcus Webb found the worst evidence in the cabin's back room, where Tate had constructed what could only be described as a laboratory of suffering. Implements designed for specific types of torment hung from wooden pegs like a surgeon's instruments. A wooden chair fitted with restraints occupied the room's center, its surface scarred by knife marks and stained dark with blood that had dried over many sessions. The walls bore sketches that revealed the full scope of Tate's degeneracy. Detailed anatomical drawings showed human figures in various states of distress, with notes about which methods produced which responses. Tate had been documenting the precise breaking point of human resilience, treating agony as a science to be studied and perfected. But the most damning evidence lay in a wooden chest beneath Tate's bed. Sheriff Creek opened it to reveal dozens of personal items that told the story of victims who had never made it home. Wedding rings, children's toys, scraps of fabric from dresses worn by women who'd trusted Tate to return them to their families rather than to unmarked graves in Virginia's forests. Horror as a professional service. The discovery that shook Creek most deeply was a collection of daguerreotypes showing Tate posed with his victims in various stages of their ordeal. The images revealed a man who had found profound satisfaction in documenting human suffering, creating a gallery of despair that he apparently revisited for personal pleasure. Among these photographs was one that made Creek's blood run cold. William Tate, standing behind a kneeling figure that Creek recognized as Samuel Mitchell, Moses's nephew, who had disappeared while attempting to reach his wife in Maryland 2 years earlier. The image showed Samuel's condition after whatever Tate had done to him in this cabin, and it explained why the young man's body had never been found, despite extensive searches. The revelation transformed their understanding of how many people William Tate had actually killed. The official record showed successful captures and occasional deaths during pursuit, but the evidence in this cabin suggested that Tate had been murdering fugitive slaves as a matter of routine practice, returning only those who served his purposes as living advertisements for his effectiveness. Creek found himself facing a dilemma that challenged every assumption about justice in 1833 Virginia. They had evidence of systematic murder committed by a white man against black victims, but they also had a legal system that barely recognized such crimes as worthy of prosecution. What would Goochland County do when faced with proof that their most trusted slave catcher had been a serial killer operating under legal protection? The answer would reveal as much about the community's character as Tate's cabin had revealed about his. The walls were closing in on more than just one monster. They were closing in on everyone who had enabled him through willful blindness and profitable ignorance. Section 6. The Community's Choice. The emergency meeting convened in Goochland's courthouse at 10:30 p.m. on April 22, 1833, with only the county's most prominent citizens in attendance. Candlelight flickered across faces that had aged years in the days since Sheriff Creek's discovery, while outside, spring rain drummed against windows like accusations waiting to be heard. Judge William Thornton called the gathering to order with the grim formality of someone presiding over a funeral rather than a legal proceeding. Around the table sat plantation owners, merchants, and civic leaders who had all, at one time or another, employed William Tate's services. Now they faced the terrible recognition that their complicity had enabled unspeakable crimes. The physical evidence was undeniable. 43 personal items belonging to missing slaves, detailed documentation of torture sessions, and photographs that proved systematic murder disguised as professional duty. But the legal implications were staggering. In a society built on the premise that black lives existed primarily to serve white interests, Thomas Randolph spoke first, his voice betraying the strain of a man who had just learned that his trusted employee was a monster. We hired him to maintain order, not to conduct experiments. How many families have we told that their property died during legitimate recapture? The question hung in the tobacco-scented air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone present had accepted Tate's explanations without investigation, choosing profit over scrutiny when inconvenient questions arose. They'd created the perfect environment for a predator to operate with legal immunity. Sheriff Creek presented his findings methodically, each piece of evidence building a case that would normally result in hanging if the perpetrator were available for prosecution. But William Tate remained missing, presumably dead in the Virginia wilderness, leaving the community to grapple with justice when the guilty party was beyond reach. The slaves who worked with him, suggested merchant Henry Carter, surely they witnessed these crimes. We could question them, determine the full extent of his activities. Judge Thornton's response revealed the central paradox they faced. Black testimony against white defendants is inadmissible in Virginia courts. Even if we found witnesses, their words carry no legal weight. Blood money has no conscience. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them like a shroud. They had evidence of multiple murders, but no perpetrator to prosecute. They had potential witnesses, but no legal mechanism to hear their testimony. Most troubling of all, they had a community reputation to protect in a society where admitting such massive failure would undermine the very foundations of their authority. Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had examined several of Tate's returned captives over the years, offered a perspective that chilled the gathering. I treated injuries that I attributed to resistance during capture. Broken bones, burns, wounds that seemed excessive even for violent recapture. We all saw the signs and chose more comfortable explanations. The confession opened floodgates of uncomfortable recognition. Each man present could remember instances when Tate's methods had seemed questionable, when returned slaves bore injuries that suggested torture rather than necessary force. They'd ignored their suspicions because Tate's effectiveness served their interests too well to question. Plantation owner Charles Morrison raised the question that everyone had been avoiding. What do we tell the families who hired him? How do we explain that we enabled a madman to murder their property while charging them for the privilege? The economic implications were staggering. If Tate's crimes became public knowledge, every plantation owner who had employed him could face lawsuits from neighboring estates whose slaves had been murdered instead of returned. The legal and financial damage could destroy Goochland County's entire planter class. Judge Thornton proposed a solution that revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of their society. William Tate disappeared while pursuing a dangerous fugitive. His methods, while effective, resulted in his death at the hands of the criminal he was tracking. We investigated his cabin and found evidence of struggle, but nothing that suggests criminal behavior on his part. The cover-up was born in that candlelit room, conceived by men who valued their reputations more than justice for Tate's victims. They would destroy the evidence, scatter the personal items in the James River, and create a narrative that transformed a serial killer into a martyr who died serving their community's interests. But cover-ups, like murders, leave traces that surface when least expected. The truth about William Tate's crimes would eventually emerge, carried by voices that Virginia law refused to hear, but history would not allow to remain silent. The real monster wasn't just William Tate. It was the system that created, protected, and ultimately absolved him of responsibility for crimes that shocked even his enablers. The slave quarters at Randolph Plantation buzzed with whispered conversations that moved like underground rivers, carrying truth through a community that had learned to communicate in languages their masters never bothered to learn. 3 days after the courthouse meeting, while Goochland's white leadership crafted their comfortable lies, the people who had actually witnessed William Tate's crimes began to speak. The smell of cornbread and collard greens drifted from cabin windows, while children's laughter mixed with the soft hum of evening prayers, creating a soundscape of normalcy that masked the revolution brewing in hushed tones. These were the voices Virginia law refused to acknowledge, but which carried the only authentic testimony about what had really happened in those dark Virginia woods. Old Betty, who had survived 67 years of bondage and witnessed more horrors than most people could imagine, served as the unofficial historian for 3 plantations. Her cabin became the gathering place where survivors of Tate's hunts finally found the courage to share their experiences with people who would believe them. "That devil didn't hunt runaways," Betty said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much to be silenced by fear. "He hunted souls, made sport of breaking people before he broke their bodies." The testimonies that emerged painted a picture of systematic sadism that went far beyond the evidence found in Tate's cabin. Marcus Williams, who had survived one of Tate's capture sessions, described days of psychological torture designed not just to prevent future escape attempts, but to destroy the victim's sense of humanity entirely. From the oral testimony preserved by Underground Railroad records, Tate would catch you, but he wouldn't take you home right away. He'd keep you in that cabin for days, asking questions about other runaways, other plans. The pain was just to make you talk, but the talking was to make you betray your people. The testimonies revealed Tate's true purpose. He wasn't just catching individual fugitives, but dismantling entire networks of resistance by torturing information from his captives. Every successful escape route he discovered was shared with other slave catchers, making the Underground Railroad increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell's father, Moses, had returned from Pennsylvania with news that his daughter lived free in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress and teaching literacy to other fugitives. But he also carried a message that would change how the slave community viewed their situation. Sarah's act of resistance had proven that their oppressors were not invincible. The word spread through Virginia's slave quarters like wildfire. William Tate was dead, killed by a 19-year-old woman who had refused to accept her fate. For a community conditioned to believe in white supremacy through violence, Sarah Mitchell's victory represented a crack in the foundation of their oppression. Resistance takes many forms. The psychological impact extended beyond simple inspiration. Slaves who had lived in terror of recapture began to understand that their hunters were mortal men, not supernatural forces of inevitability. The careful balance of fear that maintained plantation discipline started to shift in ways that worried Virginia's ruling class. But the slave community also understood that Sarah's victory had come at a terrible cost. Tate's disappearance had prompted increased patrols, harsher punishments for suspected escape attempts, and a general tightening of restrictions that made life harder for everyone in bondage. Freedom for one had meant increased oppression for thousands of others. Young Jim, who had helped guide Sarah to the Pennsylvania border, brought disturbing news from his travels. Other slave catchers were adopting Tate's methods, using torture as a standard tool for extracting information about escape networks. Sarah's victory had inspired imitators who lacked even Tate's pretense of legal authority. The testimonies also revealed something that the white community had missed entirely. Tate hadn't been working alone. Several plantation owners had provided him with information about potential runaways, creating an intelligence network that made escape attempts far more dangerous than fugitives realized. These collaborators included respected members of Goochland society who had attended the emergency meeting, men who had helped Tate select his victims while maintaining public personas as benevolent masters. The slave community knew their names, their methods, and their continuing threat to anyone who dreamed of freedom. As summer approached, two parallel narratives about William Tate's crimes existed in the same county. The official story spoke of a dedicated public servant who had died in the line of duty, while the authentic story told of a monster whose death had merely made room for others like him to emerge from Virginia's shadows. The truth, as always, belonged to the people who had paid for it with their blood and their silence. The first sighting came on a moonless night in August, 1834, more than a year after William Tate's body had sunk into the creek bed near Sarah Mitchell's battlefield. A slave named Peter, attempting to reach his wife on a plantation near Fredericksburg, swore he encountered a pale figure in the forest who spoke with Tate's voice and carried his distinctive, scarred hunting knife. The encounter occurred where two logging roads crossed, creating a natural clearing that fugitive slaves often used as a navigation point. Peter described a man who seemed to materialize from shadow itself, wearing clothes that appeared to be rotting on his body, while his skin held the gray pallor of something long dead. The whispered conversations that carried this story through Virginia's slave quarters transformed it with each telling, but certain details remained consistent. The figure's obsessive interest in extracting information about escape routes, its ability to appear and disappear without sound, and most unsettling of all, its apparent knowledge of secrets that only the living William Tate could have possessed. These weren't simple ghost stories born from community trauma. They were accounts that contained specific information about slave catcher techniques, plantation layouts, and Underground Railroad safe houses that suggested either supernatural knowledge or very earthly intelligence gathering by parties unknown. Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had examined many of Tate's victims during the monster's living years, began collecting these accounts with the systematic approach of someone conducting medical research. His private notes, discovered after his death in 1867, revealed a pattern that troubled him deeply. From Dr. Hayes's journal, September 12, 1834, 3 separate accounts now describe encounters with a figure matching Tate's physical description in locations where he conducted hunts. The accounts share details that the witnesses could not have known unless they had met someone intimately familiar with Tate's methods. The sightings followed a geographical pattern that suggested either a very corporeal ghost or someone using Tate's reputation to terrorize the slave community while gathering intelligence about resistance activities. Reports came from areas where escape attempts had increased following news of Sarah Mitchell's victory, as if something was actively hunting the inspiration her success had created. More disturbing were the physical evidence left behind at encounter sites. fragments of rope arranged in patterns Tate had used for restraining captives, knife marks on trees that matched his distinctive blade, and most chilling of all, ashes from fires that had been used to burn personal items belonging to runaway slaves. The psychological impact on Virginia's enslaved population was profound and precisely calculated. Fear of the supernatural, Tate began to discourage escape attempts more effectively than increased patrols or harsher punishments ever had. The legend was becoming a more powerful tool of oppression than the man had ever been. Young fugitives who might have risked flight began to question whether death truly ended their persecution. If William Tate could continue hunting from beyond the grave, what hope did any slave have of achieving lasting freedom? The ghost stories were serving someone's interests, and those interests aligned perfectly with Virginia's plantation system. But the slave community also produced counter-narratives that suggested a different interpretation of these supernatural encounters. Some stories described the spectral Tate being driven away by mentions of Sarah Mitchell's name, or by reciting specific Bible verses that Moses Mitchell had taught his congregation. These accounts implied that even a supernatural predator might be vulnerable to the right kind of resistance. Death doesn't end all hunts. The legend of William Tate's ghost served multiple purposes for different constituencies. Plantation owners found it useful for discouraging escape attempts without officially acknowledging that they were spreading supernatural terror among their human property. Slave catchers discovered that invoking Tate's spirit made their threats more effective with potential fugitives who had heard the stories. But for the enslaved community, the ghost stories became a way of processing trauma while maintaining hope. If Sarah Mitchell could kill William Tate once, perhaps other forms of resistance could banish his spirit permanently. The legend became both a source of fear and a template for overcoming that fear through collective action. The truth about these supernatural encounters would remain buried in Virginia's soil until the Civil War unleashed forces that made all ghosts seem less frightening than the very real horrors that living men could inflict on each other. By then, William Tate's legacy had evolved far beyond a single monster's crimes into something that revealed the supernatural dimensions of systematic oppression itself. Even today, local historians in Goochland County speak of unexplained disappearances along certain forest roads, and hunting guides warn visitors away from creek beds where the water runs red without apparent cause. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.